Great. Hi, thank you so much, Adam, for hosting this. My name is Sofia Vargas. I'm an analyst at C4ADS on the Organized Crime and Grand Corruption Cell, where I focus my analysis mainly on corruption networks in Venezuela, as well as sanctions on Venezuela by the US. We can go ahead and start the presentation now. So I've got this first slide I hope you can all see. Yes, the title of the presentation, US Sanctions in Venezuela, using AIS and network analysis to visualize impact. So this presentation today will focus on our use of AIS data paired with publicly available information, mostly corporate ownership information regarding the vessels that we're investigating. Using all of this to help get a baseline understanding of how US sanctions on the Venezuelan oil sector have played out in related shipping networks. So I'll go into first an introduction of the organization, as well as an introduction to this specific topic and our methodology in analyzing the effects of sanctions on shipping in Venezuela. So first, a short introduction to who we are, to C4ADS. Those of you who might have attended my colleague Evan Accardi's presentation last week might be familiar with this slide and with this information. C4ADS is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that leverages high advantage publicly available information, as well as cutting edge emerging technologies to help solve current transnational security challenges. Our aim is to expose and disrupt illicit networks using evidence-based analysis that combines disparate data sources to help kind of enlighten partners both in government, in civil society, and in industry on how to combat illicit activity around the world. So we aim to share our analysis with agencies both domestically and abroad, with journalists and civil society industry to help kind of bridge the information gap that exists between them, to hopefully enact change in how we understand and disrupt illicit networks transnationally. Our impact can best be seen in the number of designations that we might help enact, targeted U.S. Treasury designations against corrupt networks that we help analyze, also in the amount of illicit contraband that is seized, and in the dollar amount of illicit financial flows that we can help disrupt. So our topics of analysis that we focus on range anywhere from wildlife trafficking to natural resource exploitation, from grand-scale corruption to weapons proliferation and weapons trafficking. So we work on a variety of problem sets. Our analysis is done by a group of young multilingual analysts who focus on different regions, but also on working with different data sources. And you'll get an idea of that in the presentation that I'm giving today. So first, to help kind of put the topic in context, I'll be focusing on one specific designation that has taken place in 2019. U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, which is Venezuela's state-owned oil company. And that is kind of serves as the basis of our analysis in understanding how these sanctions have had ramifications in the related shipping industry, and how shipping networks have responded to these U.S. sanctions in the past year. So to give a little bit of background, Executive Order 13850 is the executive order that kind of paved the way for PDVSA to be sanctioned. On November 1st, 2018, EO 13850 was announced, and it originally authorized sanctions on persons operating in the Venezuelan gold sector. But it also allowed for future determinations by the US Treasury Department to focus on other sectors that might also be contributing to the situation in Venezuela, or might be allegedly involved in corruption in the country. This scope of the executive order was applied to the oil sector on January 28, 2019, and that is the date on which Petróleos de Venezuela was sanctioned. So, as some of you might know who have either listened to my colleague's presentation last week or who work kind of in the maritime space, these sanctions do have pretty complicated and often hard to navigate effects. US Treasury Department periodically publishes advisories to help kind of navigate and synthesize the expected effects of sanctions in related industries. The most recent advisory came out this past month, on May 14th, and it mostly deals with the DPRK, Syria, and Iran sanctions programs, and highlights, among other things, a list of deceptive shipping practices that are often seen exhibited by vessels that are attempting to evade sanctions. So some of these shipping practices include disabling or manipulating AIS transmissions. You might also see an increase in ship-to-ship transfers to transport oil or oil products, and as well as complex ownership or management structures surrounding these vessels. So in an attempt to help understand the effects of sanctions in the Venezuela case, we've gone with the methodology that I'll present next. It has also become pretty pertinent recently. Some of you might know 5 Iranian tankers were sent to Venezuela in the past few weeks to deliver fuel. There have been extended fuel shortages in recent years, but also even more recently due to sanctions in Venezuela and the COVID crisis. And it's just interesting from like a geopolitical broader context to see these states working together in spite of sanctions or amidst sanctions. But also we take a look at C4 ADS on the more granular level, network responses to these events. So the methodology that I'll be explaining can kind of best be explained in 3 parts. So first, what we did to tackle this problem set as it relates to Venezuela was download initially in tabular format AIS data from Windward, which is our maritime platform partner that we work with closely. We downloaded AIS data that was geographically bound within the Venezuelan EEZ to get positional data on vessels operating in those waters, specifically tanker vessels, between January 28, 2018 and January 28, 2020. So those are 2 years of port call activity data that we can then use to compare against each other and see how these effects or how these sanctions have played out in shipping voyages, in ships' voyages. We then use the vessel data that we got from Windward to query IHS Market, the platform that we use to get corporate ownership information as well as potentially compliance information. What we got was an underlying over 1,000 entities that are linked to the vessels of interest, which from that AIS data poll, we got over 900 vessels that were operating, tanker vessels specifically to be exact, in Venezuelan waters, both the year before and after sanctions. So then using these bulk data sets, which are in tabular format. We ingest them into Palantir Gotham and Palantir Foundry to run network analysis as well as trends analysis, and to see, where are these ships generally going after they leave Venezuela? How many companies are registered in X jurisdiction that operate or own these vessels? So those are the kinds of questions we can answer using the network analysis tools that we have available to us through Palantir. So a few top-line findings of this methodology. First, we found that there was a 46% decrease in the number of port calls by tanker vessels in Venezuelan waters. So what I didn't mention during the introduction to the sanctions program is that as a result of the sanction against PDVSA, there have been a series of designations of vessels and vessel-owning companies by U.S. Treasury Department. So right now, there are currently about 12 tanker vessels that are designated under that executive order. Many other vessels have been designated, but they're mostly tug vessels or other smaller ships owned by PDVSA. But basically, U.S. government has, in the months following the initial designation on PDVSA, increased designations on ships that facilitate trade of oil from Venezuela. So obviously, that would correlate with the decrease in port call activity that we're seeing in Venezuelan waters. There are existing reasons for that, overall decline in port call activity, but definitely the correlation with the date on which PDVSA was sanctioned is pretty stark. We've also, using AIS data and specifically port call data, which is measured by kind of extended periods of time that ships are at port in Venezuela. We've also identified the ports that are visited by tanker vessels in Venezuela. The top port or most frequently visited port being Jose Oil Terminal, which is Venezuela's main export terminal for crude oil. Also, will be relevant to the case study that I'll show next. So to give you kind of an example of how our methodology plays out and how we can see it in an actual case of a ship, the Princess Mary is an example that I'll go through today. This is a Liberian flagged crude oil tanker that was reportedly shipping crude oil under charter by Rosneft, the Russian energy firm, to deliver crude oil from Jose Oil Terminal in December 2019 via ship-to-ship transfer off the coast of Togo. This ship came out in reporting to have done so, and that determination was made using satellite imagery. There's a Washington Post article on it if you'd like to learn more. We mapped out its corporate ownership network and saw relative opacity in its network. Also a kind of a red flag that is outlined in maritime advisories. But also we saw the vessel exhibiting dark activity or losing AIS transmission, potentially manipulating its AIS transmissions to disguise the fact that it had delivered oil from Venezuela or picked up oil from Venezuela. So this is the December 2019 voyage that I'm showing on the screen right now. You can see the ship entering Martinican waters and then subsequently losing AIS transmission where that triangle with the red dot is located. And then days later, on December 3rd, exiting Trinidadian and Tobagonian waters to then deliver crude via ship-to-ship transfer. So this is an example of kind of beyond the scope of our methodology, showing dark activity outside of immediate Venezuelan waters, yet still having ships entering waters without transmitting AIS, and potentially disguising the fact that they are there to do business. So by further looking into Princess Mary's voyage history, we were able to see that the December 2019 trip has not been the Princess Mary's only trip to Caribbean waters. On January 9th, 2020, we saw the ship again return to Caribbean waters, entering waters near Tobago, losing AIS transmission, and then days later, on January 22nd, reappearing in AIS, exiting Tobagonian waters, and also in addition to that, reporting a draft change, indicating an increase in cargo. The vessel then made its way to Malaysian waters and returned again to the Caribbean on April 23rd, 2020. Again, it lost AIS transmission, then exited waters days later on May 11th, and kind of is currently still making its way east. So although we, in these two voyages, might not know whether or not the vessel actually arrived to Jose Oil Terminal or to Venezuela to pick up oil, we can say with at least some certainty that this pattern is typical for this ship. This pattern of losing AIS transmission as it gets closer to this geographic area, and then reappearing again, potentially having carried oil from somewhere nearby. So using this trend or this pattern of activity, we can query windward to search for similar activity in nearby waters to Venezuela, thereby expanding our area of analysis and the possibilities of identifying ships that may be acting in similar ways, yet not being pinged in our port call activity. And so an example of a ship, again, that's done something similar, and that can be identified using similar patterns of AIS activity. The Aurora Borealis is another ship that has also appeared to have exhibited dark activity in those waters. We also see other similarities with the Princess Mary case, and that it's also a Liberia flagged vessel. Pretty common for these sorts of tankers to be flagged to a country like Liberia, but again is another pattern or similarity to follow given the sanctions activity there, and also indicating draft changes. With increase of cargo on the vessel, and thereby beyond that, what we can use is corroborating information, either satellite imagery or port record data to see if in fact the vessel was visiting Venezuela to pick up oil. So this is just an example of this of our methodology, the possibilities that there are in pairing AIS data with corporate network activity, and again serves as kind of a baseline in seeing what's happening as a result of sanctions in the maritime domain near Venezuela. And would like to further expand it using greater access to satellite imagery, and if there ever is official port call data from the Venezuelan government, using that sort of data as well to bolster our analysis. So thank you so much for listening to that. If you have any questions, please let me know. And that concludes the presentation.
Awesome. I'm going to pop in here real quick. We got a couple questions. Hopefully a couple more come in. But the first off is, as you're tracking, what's the after action for some of the reports? Where do you send these reports? And how do you see I'm sure some of these vessels are intercepted sometimes. And you see kind of behavior that as it happens as well with some of these vessels?
So it's rare in the Venezuela case. These are relatively newer sanctions that don't have as much alignment from other countries. I mean, really, we're spearheading the sanctions there as a country. The U.S. is, at least. So not seeing as many interceptions really, but more a definite change in the overall pattern of activity that we're seeing in Venezuela as more and more companies are kind of pulling out of the country in an effort to avoid U.S. sanctions. And so really this is our analysis on this front is to inform U.S. government, U.S. industry as well, or the shipping industry to see kind of what the immediate ramifications have been of sanctions in this area. But we've also shared this analysis with reporters in Venezuela and journalists who work on this to help kind of what they want to answer is where is the oil going? Who are Venezuela's main partners now that the U.S. has dropped its business with PDVSA? I mean, we were one of the top customers for oil there. So that's kind of where our analysis is going and what it can be used for.
So what's the relationship like with Venezuela and the surrounding countries? And is there any interaction with some of the vessels stopping with those nearby countries on the way there? Or do most of the nearby countries, are they mostly compliant with abiding by those sanctions imposed on Venezuela?
Yeah, so one of the main targets of U.S. sanctions has actually been the trade between Venezuela and Cuba. So Venezuela has an existing agreement to trade oil with regional partners, one of them being Cuba. And it's a pretty long-standing agreement that has existed for years. And in these sanctions, we've seen U.S. target specific companies that have chartered ships to run that route between Venezuela and Cuba. And that has, when you look at data, AIS data on those voyages, you see much more dark activity occurring that could be existing from even before sanctions. As AIS loss isn't always the sign of a bad actor or of malicious intentions, but it is a pattern that we see there. Yet trade there does continue despite sanctions. We also see more trade partners in like Russia, India, China, kind of take the place of what used to be trade between U.S. and Venezuela, but not to the same extent that there was business before sanctions there. I think also within the Caribbean, I mean, there are some very nearby islands, Trinidad and Tobago being a couple of them, Aruba and the ABC Islands, that when there's dark activity there, it's hard to determine without satellite imagery if these vessels are visiting multiple places kind of during one voyage. Are they even hitting Venezuela? That's something we're working on to expand more and to get more satellite imagery access there to determine that.
Awesome. So beyond, and I don't want to get into Evan's presentation at all because I want to focus on you, but do you, from satellite imagery, do you get into some of the more publicly available data sets, for example, as Sentinel and such, especially as it relates to close by land? Because obviously a lot of those sensors don't shoot without purpose over water.
So we have, and Evan has actually worked with me a little bit on this very recently. There is spotty availability of imagery, specifically on kind of like offshore platforms where where oil is picked up near Jose Oil Terminal in Venezuela. You can get we've gotten at least pretty clear imagery to kind of test and see if this methodology could be expanded using that. However, targeting it on specific export terminals would be helpful. Not sure if that answers your question.
I think it does. Mm-hmm. So in terms of emerging sensors, you kind of, towards the end of your presentation, you kind of had a kind of a wish list for data out there. And is there any emerging sensors that you have high hopes about that haven't completely turned on yet that you want to kind of use and are really hopeful about using over the next year or two?
Yeah, I mean, right now, there's been a restructuring of PDVSA as a company. Recently, there have been new appointments to leadership of the firm, and could potentially lead to more developments in the refineries near these ports. It would be interesting, to get more, more of a proliferation of satellite imagery on these locations, and see, what's going on in terms of development. I think it's something that I don't know how much it's been explored in Venezuela, but could be interesting to analyze further down the line.
Absolutely. Well, with that said, I think that's all the questions that have come in so far, and I think it was a great presentation. I appreciate you coming onto the Geospatial Frontier Virtual Technology Fair. And any last minute plugs you want to get before we sign off?
Definitely. Please take a look at our blog on c4ads.org. That's our website. There you can read more about our work in this space, as well as access a lot of our public reports on other methodologies that we work with, other problem sets as well. Excellent.
With that, let's see. So once again, thank you very much. This is Adam Simmons with Project Geospatial, hosting a Geospatial Frontier Virtual Technology Fair, here with Sofia Vargas, correct?
Yes.
And on the topic of U.S. sanctions in Venezuela, using AIS in network analysis to visualize impact. Thank you, everybody, for watching.